Light. There is a specific kind of darkness that only exists in childhood. It's a heavy, suffocating pitch black that wraps around you when the lights go out, convincing you that the shadows in the corner of your room are breathing. For most of us, we grow up, the lights come on, and we realize it was just a pile of laundry or the branch of an old oak tree scraping against the glass. We learn to rationalize. We learn to sleep. But what happens when you grow up and you realize the shadows were just in your head? What happens when the things that go bump in the night leave physical scars on the floorboards? Think back to when you were 9 years old. I was living with my mother and my little sister. She was only 5 at the time. We resided in a modest, cramped house nestled deep within a painfully quiet town. On the surface, it was the picture of suburban innocence. During the suffocating heat of the summer, children would swarm the sidewalks, their bicycle tires humming against the hot pavement. It was, by all accounts, a safe street. Yet, even then, a lingering unease coated the inside of our home like a film of dust. My mother always had an excuse. She would wipe down the counters, look around the dimly lit kitchen, and tell us that it was merely an old house. And old houses, she'd remind us, have bones that ache. They settle. They make noises. But the sounds that echoed through those narrow hallways did not belong to settling wood or contracting pipes. They sounded entirely different. They sounded deliberate. And even now, decades later, I still cannot find a rational explanation for what was breathing inside those walls. The terror didn't begin with a grand, cinematic crescendo. It began quietly, on a night when sleep simply refused to take me. I was lying rigidly in my bed, the heavy blanket pulled up tight against my chin, acting as a flimsy shield against the dark. I lay there, staring up at the cheap, plastic glow and the dark stars my mother had stuck to the ceiling. My room was claustrophobic small. It held nothing more than a twin bed, a worn wooden dresser, and a heavy toy chest positioned directly beneath the window. Outside, the wind was picking up, and I watched the twisted silhouettes of the tree branches dancing violently across my bedroom wall. I repeated the comforting lie in my head. It's just the trees. It's just the wind. But then, my eyes adjusted to the gloom, and I realized that one of the shadows wasn't dancing with the others. It was crouched low, in the deepest, darkest corner of the room, right beside my toy chest. It was a dense, ink-black mass that seemed to absorb the faint moonlight filtering through the glass. My rational mind desperately tried to categorize it. I told myself it was a heap of discarded clothes, or perhaps one of my oversized stuffed animals cast in a strange light. I actually felt a nervous smile tug at my lips, ready to laugh at my own childish paranoia. Then, I blinked, and the shadow was gone. It didn't retreat. It simply vanished into the ether. Immediately, a wave of profound, unnatural cold washed over me. It was a draft from the window. It was an icy, paralyzing dread that bloomed from the marrow of my bones and radiated outward. I yanked the covers over my head, squeezing my eyes shut until the colorful bursts of pressure behind my eyelids forced me into a restless exhaustion. When the pale morning light finally broke, I had almost convinced myself it was a dream, until I swung my legs out of bed and looked across the room. The heavy lid of my toy chest was standing wide open. It was positioned perfectly, as if someone, or something, had spent the night leaning over the wooden edge, casually sifting through my belongings. I knew with absolute certainty that I had not left it open. My mother ran a tight ship. Spilled toys meant a severe reprimand. My heart hammered against my ribs as I quietly walked over, pushed the heavy lid down, and swallowed the secret whole. I didn't say a single word. The silence held for a few weeks, hanging fragile and taut like a spitter bear. Then, my 5-year-old sister shattered it. We were in the living room when she looked up at my mother and, with the terrifying, casual innocence only a toddler possesses, stated that she did not like the man in her closet. I stopped breathing. Light. The blood in my veins turned to ice water. She didn't say it like she was frightened. She stated it as a mundane matter of fact, the way you might complain about the weather. Light. My mother, entirely unfazed, offered a dismissive wave of her hand. She rattled off the usual parental platitudes about overactive imaginations and imaginary friends. But I was staring dead at my sister's face. I saw the absolute sincerity behind her wide, blinking eyes. She wasn't spinning a fairy tale. She went on to explain, in her tiny, quiet voice, that the man would stand inside the dark confines of her closet every single night, and he would whisper. She said she could hear the raspy cadence of his voice, but she could never quite make out the words. That evening, my mother tucked her into bed, smoothing the blankets and reciting a protective prayer into the quiet room. And I watched from the doorway. I watched as my mother turned off the light and closed the door, completely neglecting to open the closet and check inside. I barely slept that night. I was hovering in that miserable twilight between wakefulness and nightmares when a sound snapped my eyes wide open. Scrape. Scrape. It was coming from the floorboards directly beside my bed. It was a slow, agonizing sound of something heavy dragging itself across the hardwood. It sounded distinctly like rigid, yellowed fingernails digging into the grain of the floor. The sound crept closer, inch by agonizing inch, until it stopped. Right at the edge of my mattress. I was paralyzed. My muscles locked. My throat tightened around a scream that refused to surface. I knew with every fiber of my being that if I tilted my head and looked over the edge of the mattress, I would be met with something staring directly back up at me. I remained utterly motionless, my fingers clutching the fabric of my blanket so hard my knuckles ached, until my body finally shut down from sheer terror. When morning came, I immediately looked down at the floor, and there they were, deep, violent scratches gouged into the wood, right beside where my head had been resting. Fresh, splintered carvings that looked as though someone had taken a hunting knife to the floorboards. Panic consumed me. I sprinted down the hall to grab my mother, dragging her into the room to look at the evidence. Instead of comforting me, her face contorted with anger. She accused me of playing with sharp tools, of recklessly dragging heavy furniture across her nice floors. I pleaded with her. I swore on my life that I hadn't done it. But the truth was too terrifying for her to accept. She refused to believe me. After that, the entities stopped hiding. The nights devolved into a waking nightmare. As soon as the sun went down, the whispers would begin. They bled out from the cracks of my closet door, faint and rhythmic, like a radio dial tuned to static, playing at the absolute lowest volume. Down the hall, my sister would begin to wail. I would sprint into her room, my bare feet slapping against the cold floor, only to find her sitting up in bed hyperventilating. Her trembling finger would always be pointed directly at the darkest corner of her room. "HCS there," she would sob hysterically. "HCS there." I never saw him in those moments. But the air in the room would be so thick, so heavily charged with electricity, that the hairs on my arms would stand at attention. You know that primal, instinctual feeling you get when unseen eyes are burning into the back of your neck. It was that, but magnified 1,000 times over. The absolute pinnacle of this nightmare arrived in the dead of winter. I jolted awake in the middle of the night. The temperature in the room had plummeted. I looked toward the doorway and felt my stomach drop. My bedroom door was standing wide open. I was meticulous about shutting it tight before bed. It was my only barrier against the rest of the house. Through the open frame, I could see the comforting, warm glow of the hallway nightlight my mother always left on. As I stared, completely unblinking, the hallway lights simply clicked off. Darkness flooded the corridor. I tried to reason with myself. A blown bulb. Just a blown bulb. Then the footsteps started. Heavy, methodical thuds echoing down the hall. walking directly toward my room. They stopped just outside my doorframe. I opened my mouth to scream for my mother, to beg for her to come save me, but my vocal cords were paralyzed. The hinges of my door let out a long, agonizing creak. A shape leaned into my room. It was impossibly tall, a towering, solid mass of absolute darkness. Only its head and shoulders breached the threshold, angling down as if stooping to look inside. I squeezed my eyes shut so tightly they throbbed, throwing myself into a desperate charade of sleep, praying to whatever was listening that it would spare me. I counted the seconds. When I finally found the courage to peel my eyelids open, the door was firmly closed. The room was empty. The next morning, I confronted my mother. I asked if she had checked on me during the night. She looked confused and said no, she had been dead asleep. Beside me, my sister chimed in quietly. She had seen the man again, standing silently beside her bed. United in our terror, we told my mother everything. For the first time, the veil of denial slipped from her face. She looked genuinely, deeply frightened. That afternoon, she walked through the house with a lit candle, her voice trembling as she recited a desperate prayer in every single room. For a brief, fleeting period, the house fell silent. We thought it was over. It happened on a random Tuesday afternoon. I had just gotten home from school and was entirely alone in the house. I was sitting on the living room couch, chewing on a pencil and staring at my homework, when a sound echoed from down the hall. Slam. It was the heavy, unmistakable sound of my wooden toy chest dropping shut. I froze. I was the only living, breathing thing in the house. I tried to blame the wind, but all the windows were shut against the winter chill. My legs felt like lead as I forced myself to walk down the hallway. My bedroom door was wide open. The lid of the toy chest was firmly closed. But every single toy I owned was violently scattered across the entirety of the bedroom floor. It looked as though someone had picked the heavy chest up, upended it, and hurled its contents across the room in a fit of absolute rage. I didn't step foot inside. I backed away slowly, turning on my heel, and went to sit on the front porch in the freezing cold until my mother's car pulled into the driveway. When I brought her inside and showed her the chaos, she still clung to her denial. She looked at the devastation and blamed the family cat. It wasn't until years later, long after we had packed our lives into boxes and fled that suffocating house, that I finally got the truth. I sat my mother down and asked her, point blank, if she had ever experienced anything unexplainable while we lived there. She looked away, her eyes glossing over with an old, buried fear. She hesitated for a long time. Then, she softly said, yes. She confessed that she would frequently wake up in the dead of night to find a massive, shadowy figure standing silently in her bedroom doorway. She swore she never told us because she didn't want to validate our terror. She didn't want to make it real. But she admitted, with a heavy sigh, that the house was profoundly sick. She believed it was the spirit of a man who had lived there long before us, a man who never wanted to leave. She refused to speak of it again, but her admission changed nothing for me. I already knew what I had seen. I knew the terror that had gripped my sister. Even today, as a fully grown adult, sitting in the safety of a modern home, just thinking about that house makes a cold nausea pool in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't the wild imagination of a child. It was a tangible, aggressive entity, and it desperately wanted us to know we were not alone. Because on the worst night, when the silence of my bedroom grows too loud and sleep remains out of reach, I can still hear the agonizing sound of brittle nails, slowly dragging across the floorboards. You might think that escaping a haunted house is the end of the story. You pack your bags, you move to a new zip code, and the nightmare ends. But sometimes the trauma doesn't stay behind in the floorboards. Sometimes you carry the scent of prey with you. I was 10 years old when my family upgraded. My mother had recently remarried, and our expanding family desperately needed more space. We moved into a beautiful, spacious home in a different neighborhood. It was significantly newer than our previous nightmare, surrounded by lush, towering trees and the comforting hum of suburban life. I remember walking through the front door and exhaling. I truly believed I was finally going to be safe. For the first few weeks, the illusion held. The house was bright, airy, and normal. But slowly, the atmosphere began to curdle. Small, microscopic anomalies began to pile up, weaving a new tapestry of dread. My new bedroom was situated at the very end of a long hallway. It boasted two large windows that overlooked the sprawling backyard, and a closet that was unnervingly deep, much deeper than the one in the old house. I actually loved the room, right up until my very first night sleeping in it. I woke up sharply around midnight. The silence of the house was absolute, save for a sound originating from the depths of my new, deep closet. It was a soft, rhythmic shuffling, like a hand gently brushing against hanging fabric. Swish, swish. I propped myself up on my elbows, staring into the dark corner of the room. I played the rationalization game again. I told myself it was the Vox system kicking on, or the foundation of the new house settling into the earth. It is a cliché, I know, but it is the psychological defense mechanism we all use to keep from losing our minds in the dark. But then, the closet door moved. It didn't swing wide open on its hinges. It shivered. The heavy wooden door visibly vibrated, as if a hand had been placed flat against the inside wouldn't apply to steady, testing pressure. Every instinct screamed at me to bolt from the mattress and run screaming into my mother's new bedroom. But fear is a paralyzing agent. I was locked in place, my eyes glued to the shivering wood, until my brain simply short-circuited and plunged me back into a terrified unconsciousness. When the sun rose, I opened my eyes. The closet door, which I had aggressively clicked shut the night before, was resting an inch ajar. A dark, vertical sliver of blackness staring back at me. I casually asked my mother at breakfast if she had come in to put away laundry. She hadn't. She offered a dismissive theory about the air conditioning vents altering the air pressure. But I looked at the vent, and I looked at the heavy door. It wasn't the wind. Things escalated rapidly from there. The shuffling gave way to something far more aggressive. I started hearing a distinct, rhythmic tapping against my bedroom window. Tap, 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 tap. Initially, I blamed the trees in the backyard. But when I pressed my face to the cold glass and peered out into the darkness, I realized there wasn't a single branch within 10 feet of my window. Like, the tapping would persist for agonizing minutes. Mike, the moment I yanked my blanket over my head, retreating into my fabric bunker, the sound would instantly cease. It was playing a game with me. I tried to ignore it. I truly did. Until one night, the tapping was so loud I couldn't take it anymore. I slowly lowered the blanket and peeked over the windowsill. Pressed flat against the outside of the glass was a hand. It was an impossibly pale, almost translucent hand. The fingers were splayed wide, pressing so hard against the pane that the flesh was flattened. My heart stopped. My bedroom was on the second floor. There was no balcony, no trellis, and the ground was a sheer drop below. Whoever, or whatever, was pressing their hand against my window was suspended in midair. The hand remained perfectly stationary for an eternity. Night, agonizingly slowly, it slid straight down the glass, disappearing into the darkness below. I didn't blink for the rest of the night. The moment morning broke, I told my mother everything. Her reaction was worse than denial. She threw her head back and laughed. She genuinely thought I was playing an elaborate prank. When she saw the sheer, unadulterated panic radiating from my face, her laughter died, but she pivoted immediately to condescension. She insisted I was experiencing a hypnagogic hallucination, that I was half asleep and projecting a dream onto reality. It was a load of absolute garbage, and I knew it. I turned to my new stepdad for help. He scoffed, accusing me of fabricating ghost stories to steal attention from his new marriage. He got a great chuckle out of my terror. But I noticed something peculiar after that conversation. Every single night, without fail, my stepdad ensured the hallway light was blazing bright before he went to bed. He didn't feel nearly as safe as he pretended to be. A month later, the haunting expanded its territory. My little brother, who was only 4 years old at the time, started casually chatting about the white lady. He would sit on the floor playing with his blocks and tell my mother that the white lady had come into his room the night before and sat on the edge of his mattress. My mother brushed it off as a harmless imaginary friend. Until the screaming started. I was jolted awake by a blood-curdling shriek tearing through the house. I launched myself out of bed and sprinted into my brother's room. He was a trembling lump beneath his duvet, sobbing hysterically. I pulled the blankets back, and he grabbed my shirt, his face stained with tears. He told me the white lady had been standing directly in front of his closed door, just staring at him. And then, he whispered the detail that made my blood run cold. He said her eyes were completely, entirely black. I didn't doubt him for a fraction of a second. I had seen the pale hand on the impossible glass. We were under siege. I began sleeping completely submerged under my blankets, terrified to expose an inch of skin to the dark room. But the blanket couldn't protect my mind. The dreams started. I dreamt of her, the white lady. She would manifest in the darkest corner of my room, a towering, looming presence. And she would whisper my name. Her voice didn't sound human. It sounded dry and brittle, like dead autumn leaves scraping together in the wind. The worst part was waking up in the pitch black, my heart racing, and realizing the dry, whispering voice was still echoing in the room. Fate, but undeniably real. The nightmare peaked on an otherwise ordinary night. I woke up with a sharp gasp, an overwhelming feeling of dread pinning me to the mattress. I looked down toward the foot of my bed. She was standing there. She was impossibly tall. Her head was tilted forward just to avoid scraping the ceiling plaster. She was draped in a tattered, flowing white dress that billowed and shifted around her legs, despite the stagnant, motionless air in the room. Her hair was a matted, stringy curtain of wet black ink falling around her face. And her face. It was chalk white, devoid of life, devoid of humanity. And my brother had been right. Where her eyes should have been, there were only two cavernous, empty black holes staring directly into my soul. I opened my jaw to scream, to unleash every ounce of terror inside me, but my lungs refused to work. I squeezed my eyes shut, silently praying for death or dawn, whichever came first. When I ripped them open again, the space at the foot of my bed was empty. But my deep closet door was standing wide open. I refused to enter that closet ever again. I wept. I begged my mother on my hands and knees to let me sleep on her floor. She coldly refused, telling me I needed to learn how to be brave. Looking back, I don't think it was a lesson in bravery. I think she was absolutely terrified, and allowing me to sleep in her room would be an admission that the monsters were real. The climax of this haunting occurred during a violent summer storm. The rain was lashing against the siding, and the wind was howling through the trees. I was jolted awake by a harsh, metallic click. I turned my head toward the window. The lock on the window sash was physically turning by itself. I watched in mute, paralyzed horror as the latch clicked open, and the heavy glass window began to slide upward, squeaking against the tracks. The rain and wind poured into the room, sending my posters flapping wildly against the walls. And then, she climbed through. The white lady didn't heave herself over the sill like a human being. She slipped through the opening and simply floated. Her bare, pale feet never once grazed the floorboards. She drifted across the room, gliding silently toward my bed. She reached the edge of my mattress and slowly leaned her towering frame forward, down, 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 until her chalk-white face was inches from my own. I could feel the temperature plummet. I felt her breath, freezing cold, smelling of ozone and dirt, brush against my cheek. And then in that horrific, dry leaf whisper, she said my name. Mike. My vocal cords finally snapped. I unleashed a primal, deafening scream that tore my throat dry. Heavy footsteps thundered down the hallway. The bedroom door flew open, and the overhead light flicked on, blinding me. My mother and stepdad were standing in the doorway, their faces pale and breathless. The room was totally empty. I looked toward the wall. The window was shut tight. The metallic latch was locked. Mike. They erupted in anger. They yelled at me for waking the house, for my theatrical screams, for my relentless ghost stories. But beneath their rage, I could see the trembling in their hands. They were terrified. The most unsettling part of that night is the gap in my memory. I have no recollection of the seconds between feeling her freezing breath on my skin and the moment my parents burst through the door. Like I lost time. I blacked out entirely. And because the window was found locked and sealed, it gave my parents the perfect ammunition to classify the entire horrific ordeal as a severe night terror. They hauled me off to a child psychologist shortly after, desperately trying to medicate the ghosts away. We remained trapped in that house for 3 more agonizing years. I never slept a full night. I never got used to the feeling of being watched. But my little brother eventually stopped mentioning the white lady, but I knew the truth. I knew she hadn't stopped visiting him. I would walk past his room late at night and hear him sobbing quietly into his pillow, whispering, "Go away. Please go away." He had just learned the same lesson I had. Talking about the monsters only earns you a trip to therapy. Even today, when a heavy storm rolls in and the wind howls against my house, I cannot bring myself to walk down a dark hallway to get a glass of water. I find myself compulsively checking the darkest corners of the ceiling, terrified I'll see a tall, chalk-white figure looming in the shadows. Trauma has a funny way of carving its initials into your adult life. And as much as I wish I could embrace the comforting logic of my therapist, that it was all just a manifestation of childhood anxiety and sleep paralysis. Can't. Because before my brother ever uttered a word about a lady with black eyes, I saw that pale hand pressed against the outside of my second-story window, and no amount of therapy can explain that away. But trauma isn't always linear. Sometimes, the most unsettling memories aren't the ones filled with dramatic screams and slamming doors. Sometimes, the most deeply buried horrors are the ones that happened in the broad, blinding daylight. Before the white lady, before the floorboards scratched in the dark. Back when I was 8 years old, I learned that the veil between the living and the dead is terrifyingly thin. I was 8, and my red bicycle was my entire world. Every single afternoon when the school bell rang, I would hit the pavement. I lived on an idyllic, tree-lined street. It was the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, where the lawns were manicured and the houses were painted in pastel colors. I rode my bike so often I knew the geography of the street by heart. I knew which cracks in the sidewalk would jolt my tires, and I knew exactly what time the mail truck would idle at the corner. There was one house, situated far down the block, that always caught my attention. It sat slightly elevated, boasting a long, sweeping driveway that led up to a sprawling, immaculate lawn. Almost every afternoon, an older gentleman would be standing at the very edge of that long driveway, right where the concrete met the public sidewalk. He always wore a sharp, classic fade or style hat, and he spent his hours simply gazing peacefully down the street. Whenever my red bike would hum past his property line, he would call out a warm, booming hello. He never once stepped foot onto the public sidewalk. He never crossed the invisible boundary of his driveway. He would just stand there, wave, and go back to observing the neighborhood. I always waved back. Mike, my mother had drilled a strict rule into my head: never cross the street unsupervised. So I never pedaled over to his side of the road. I never spoke to him face to face. That he seemed to inherently understand that boundary. Instead, he would call out to me from across the asphalt. HED ask how my math test went. HED compliment the shiny bell on my handlebars. Like, one afternoon he yelled over a cheesy joke about a cat that actually made me laugh out loud. Right, this became our routine. For weeks, we shared these fragmented, shouted conversations from across the dividing line of the street. But as the days turned into weeks, I started noticing something deeply unsettling. He knew details about my life that I had never shared. He asked me how my little brother was recovering from his cold. He complimented the paint job on my father's brand new car. I hadn't told him about a cold. I hadn't told him my dad bought a car. I rationalized it the way an 8-year-old does. I figured he was just a highly observant neighbor, watching the neighborhood through his living room curtains. One vibrant afternoon, I was cruising down the block, taking my time. He was standing in his usual spot. He tipped his hat and yelled out, "Nice bike. You want to race to the corner." I gripped my brakes, coming to a halt, and yelled back, "No, my mom would get really mad." He flashed a wide, warm smile. "White, one day," he replied, his voice carrying easily over the breeze. We talked for a few minutes about the mundane beauties of the world. He told me about a specific blue jay that frequented his back fence. He mentioned a quirky rule he had about never stepping on a loose stone near his porch. He told me a brief story about a golden retriever he used to have that would always fetch a single slipper. He spoke like a man who had nothing but infinite time to sit and observe the microscopic details of the universe. I grew fond of him. I started actively looking for his hat whenever I turned onto the block. Some days he was there, standing like a sentinel. Other days, the driveway was empty. And then, one week, he just stopped coming outside altogether. I rode past his house on a Tuesday. The driveway was barren. The heavy curtains in the front windows were drawn tightly shut, blocking out the sun. I pedaled slowly, staring at the empty concrete. It felt profoundly wrong not seeing him there. I rode home and asked my mother if I could cross the street to knock on his door. She swiftly denied the request, citing the busy road and her strict rules. A few days later, my curiosity got the better of me. I rode my bike down the street and stopped near the corner, giving me a clear view of the house's backyard. There was a woman standing in the grass. I had never seen a single soul on that property besides the man in the hat. She had her hair pulled tightly back and was holding a green plastic watering can, tending to a bed of wilting flowers. I parked my bike against the curb, far enough away that she wouldn't notice me staring. I desperately wanted to shout across the street to ask where her husband was, but a sudden wave of shy anxiety washed over me. I stayed silent, and she never looked up. A couple of days after that, I caught sight of her again. She was sitting on her back porch, cradling a coffee mug in both hands, staring off into the trees. After a few minutes, she stood, opened a small side door, and disappeared into the house. My 8-year-old brain made a split-second, rebellious decision. I pedaled to the corner, checked frantically over my shoulder to ensure my mother was nowhere in sight, and then I pushed off the curb. I pedaled across the forbidden asphalt like a bat out of hell. The house felt entirely different up close. The driveway felt impossibly long, sloping aggressively up toward the garage. I felt a heavy, oppressive wave of guilt wash over me, a sharp intuition that I was trespassing somewhere I absolutely did not belong. I stopped my bike at the very end of the driveway, resting my hand on the white wooden gate that led to the backyard. The latch rattled. The woman stepped out of the side door. She froze, looking incredibly surprised to find a small boy with a red bicycle trespassing at her back gate. She didn't look angry, just terribly confused. She walked over, unlatched the gate, then gently asked me what I was doing there. My words tumbled out in a nervous rush. I told her I was looking for the man who always stood in the driveway. The man with the hat who always said hi to me, who knew my name, who offered to race me to the corner. The woman slowly wiped her damp hands on her floral dress. The confusion on her face melted into something deeply melancholic. She looked at me and said, softly, that the man I was describing sounded exactly like her husband. Mike, my face broke into a massive smile. I fully expected her to say he was inside watching television, or that he had gone out of town to visit relatives. She did not smile back. She knelt down to my eye level, placed a hand on the gate, and said, "Honey." Mike, my husband died over a year ago. He passed away sitting in his favorite chair. His name was Harold. The warmth of the summer sun instantly vanished. A cold, cavernous space opened up violently inside my small chest. The air suddenly felt too thin to breathe. I stammered, my voice shaking, and asked if she had a photograph of him. I needed to see it. She nodded, told me to wait, and went back inside. A minute later, she returned holding a small, silver picture frame. I stared through the glass. The photograph showed a man wearing the exact same fitted Aura-style hat. He had the exact same broad, warm smile. The resemblance was uncanny. It was the man from the driveway. Then the woman pointed at the photo. She explained that the picture was taken a couple of years prior. She affectionately pointed out a distinct feature, a pale, thin scar that ran jagged from his ear down to the corner of his mouth. She said he had gotten it when he was a young man. I leaned in, my nose almost touching the glass frame. I looked at the photograph. The jagged scar was prominent, undeniable. My mind raced back to the driveway. The man I had spoken to every afternoon for weeks had a perfectly round, smooth face. There was absolutely no scar. The hat was a perfect match. The smile was identical, but the flesh was flawless. I quickly lied, telling her that maybe I did see a mark on his face once, that maybe he just had his hand covering his cheek when we spoke. She shook her head sadly. She told me that the scar had been a deep fixture on his face for decades. Sometimes he'd grow a little stubble to mask it, but it was always visible. Then, she looked me dead in the eyes and reiterated her chilling reality. She said her husband was dead. She said she lived in the house completely alone. She had only moved back to the property late last summer to finally clear out his belongings and tend to his overgrown garden. And then, she delivered the final blow. She said she had been in the house every single afternoon for weeks, and she had never, not once, seen or heard a man standing at the end of her driveway. Primal terror hijacked my nervous system. I couldn't even formulate a goodbye. I just blindly thanked her, grabbed my handlebars, and backed my bike hastily down the concrete slope. I didn't look back at the house. I didn't look back at the garden. I pedaled home in a state of absolute, deafening silence. Have you ever narrowly avoided a horrific car accident? That moment when your adrenaline spikes, and you drive the rest of the way to your destination with the radio off, both hands gripping the wheel, staring blankly ahead in shock. That was my bike ride home. I wheeled my reed bike into the garage and walked into the kitchen. My mom took one look at my pale face and simply told me to go wash up. She didn't ask questions. I didn't offer any. That night, my bedroom felt like a tomb. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling. I replayed the man's booming laugh in my head. I heard the exact cadence of his voice calling my name, and I saw the glaring, missing scar from the photograph. The next afternoon, the sun was shining brightly. I rode my bike down the street. As I approached the house, I saw the front curtains were thrown wide open. The sunlight bathed the porch and the concrete driveway in a warm glow. But the driveway was empty. No hat. No smile. Might. I stopped at the corner, raised my hand, and gave a small, hesitant wave to the empty air. Like, nothing waved back. I turned my tires and pedaled away. For a little while, life returned to normal. Or as normal as it could be. I actively mapped out new routes through the neighborhood to avoid that block entirely. I forced myself to make new friends, to fill my head with anything other than the ghost of a man named Harold. Wait, the memory began to dull. Until one night, a light, misty rain was falling over the neighborhood. I was deeply asleep when a sound cut through the quiet patter of raindrops against my window glass. It was a voice. It was coming from directly outside my first-floor bedroom window. It was a rich, booming, familiar voice. It said my name. It didn't whisper it like a monster. It called out my name with the exact same cheerful, booming inflection as the man across the street used to when offering to race me to the corner. I sat up so violently my head spun. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs. Over the sound of the rain, I heard it again, clear as day, calling for me. I let out a blood-curdling shout from my mother and instantly to beneath the covers. She burst into the room seconds later, rushing to the side of my bed. I babbled hysterically about the man, about the voice in the rain outside the glass. She rubbed circles into my back, using her soothing, maternal voice to assure me it was just the wind whistling through the window frame. To prove it, she bravely marched to the window, threw open the blinds, and peered out into the wet darkness. "See," she said gently, "there's absolutely no one out there." I forced myself out of bed and crept over to look. The streetlight illuminated the wet grass and the empty sidewalk. She was right. There was nothing but rain. My father woke up, grabbed a heavy metal flashlight, and marched out the front door. He systematically checked every single lock on the doors and windows. He swept the beam of light across the bushes in the perimeter of the house. It made me feel marginally safer, but when he returned inside, dripping wet, he confirmed the terrifying truth. The yard was entirely empty. They sat on the edge of my bed and delivered the most predictable, frustrating verdict a parent can give to a terrified child. It was just a bad dream. The next morning, my throat was raw and aching from the sheer force of my screaming. I went to school and, in a moment of desperate vulnerability, told my closest friends what had happened. They laughed in my face. They mocked me relentlessly, teasing me for actually believing in ghosts. White, one of the bolder kids in the group, actually slapped a $5 bill on the lunch table and dared me to walk down to that driveway at midnight and call the man's name out loud. I didn't touch the money. I never took the dare. Days bled into weeks, and nothing else happened. The haunting, if that's what it was, seemed to conclude with that voice in the rain. I grew up. The neighborhood morphed and shifted around me. Houses were old, families moved in and out. The woman's house eventually stood vacant for a stretch of time. I vividly remember riding past and seeing the large moving trucks hauling cardboard boxes away. Later, a new, young couple moved in and painted the front door a bright, obnoxious yellow. The driveway was soon cluttered with modern SUVs. I learned to navigate the world. I learned the names of new neighbors, the breeds of their dogs. When I turned 18, I packed my bags and left for college. I never permanently returned to that house, as my parents eventually sold it while I was away. But the memory of the man in the feeder never truly evaporated. It sits lodged deep in my chest, heavy and cold, like a small, immovable stone. As I grew older, logic began to torment me. Why didn't I ask the widow to see more photographs? Why didn't I push her for more details about his life, about his mannerisms? Why didn't I tell her everything her dead husband had spoken to me about? The answer is painfully simple. In that moment, standing at that back gate, My 8-year-old brain was utterly terrified of confronting the impossible reality that I had been casually conversing with a ghost for weeks. I've recounted this story to a select few people over the decades. They always ask the same annoying, rational questions. They ask why I didn't investigate further. Right. Maybe they're right. Maybe I should have possessed the bravery of a seasoned detective. Maybe I should have demanded to see a wedding album. But I was 8 years old. You don't think like an investigator when you're 8. You just run. A few years ago, driving through my home state on a road trip, I found myself inexplicably turning down that old, familiar street. I don't know why I did it. Might, morbid curiosity perhaps. I drove slowly. A young child was riding a bicycle near the corner, entirely oblivious to the history of the concrete beneath their tires. I rode toward the house. The long driveway was completely empty. For a brief, agonizing second, my foot hovered over the brake pedal. I desperately wanted to put the car in park, walk up to the door, and knock. I wanted to ask the strangers living inside if they ever saw an old man standing at the edge of the property line. I wanted to know if, on rainy nights, they ever heard a booming, cheerful voice calling out from the darkness. I wanted one tiny, insignificant shred of validation to close the gaping wound in my memory. But my foot moved back to the gas. I didn't stop. I kept driving, watching the house shrink in the rearview mirror until it disappeared completely. Some doors are better left permanently closed. The memory remains exactly as it was forged. And these days, I just do my absolute best to suppress it. Welcome, listeners. Settle in, pull the blankets tight, and make sure your doors are locked. We all have a fundamental expectation of safety within our own homes. The front door is a barrier against the chaotic, unpredictable world outside. But what happens when that barrier fails? What happens when the terror isn't lurking on a dark street corner, but waiting for you in the very space where you are supposed to be safe? Tonight, we are descending into the dark. We are exploring the most vulnerable, unsettling space in any home, the basement. Here are for terrifying, true accounts of subterranean horrors that will make you think twice before turning off the lights. The Stranger in the Maze. Bite. At 24, securing your first house is a milestone. It's a symbol of independence. For this young homeowner, the house was perfect. It was a solid, middle-class build with a sprawling, uniquely partitioned basement. The previous owners had carved the subterranean space into distinct sections using rough plywood and exposed framing. There was a main landing, a dedicated laundry area, a makeshift workshop, and a deep, cavernous storage room in the back. It was a maze. You couldn't stand in one spot and see the entire basement. When he first toured the house, he thought this quirky layout was cool. He wouldn't think so for long. It was a quiet weeknight, roughly 8 months after HED moved in. He needed to run a load of laundry, the only chore that ever forced him down those wooden stairs. As he opened the basement door, a subtle wave of confusion hit him. The basement lights were already on. The bulbs were ancient, yellow incandescent tests that cast a sickly, dim glow over the concrete. He distinctly remembered being down there days ago, but he simply assumed he had forgotten to hit the switch. He brushed the thought aside and began his descent. Things escalated with a violent suddenness that defied logic. He reached the bottom step. He turned toward the laundry section, and that is when a flicker of movement in his peripheral vision made his heart stop. He snapped his head to the side, crouching in the dim, yellow light, attempting to hide behind a cheap folding table, was a man. The homeowner locked eyes with the intruder. The sheer impossibility of the moment paralyzed him. The man staring back at him was filthy, looking as though he had literally dragged himself out of a city sewer. The stare he leveled at the homeowner was pure, unadulterated malice. For a second that stretched into an eternity, neither of them moved. Then, The intruder bolted, but he didn't run toward the stairs. He plunged deeper into the maze, disappearing into the dark, partitioned rooms in the back of the basement. The movement shattered the homeowner's paralysis. Pure survival instinct kicked in, and he began backpedaling toward the safety of the stairs. But he was too slow. Before his foot could touch the first step, every single light in the basement was violently extinguished. Complete, suffocating darkness swallowed him whole. He had never been down there without the lights. The blackness was absolute. Disoriented and panicked, he scrambled for the stairs, blindly trusting his memory of the room's layout. He misjudged the distance. His foot caught on something, and he crashed hard onto the concrete floor. The fall scrambled his senses. The chaos in his brain was deafening. His phone was sitting on the kitchen counter upstairs. He was trapped in a pitch-black maze with a predator. Desperation breeds strange ideas. Thinking he could intimidate the intruder, the homeowner opened his mouth and began screaming at the top of his lungs, trying to project absolute, unhinged insanity. It was a catastrophic mistake. From the deep blackness on the other side of the basement, a voice answered him. The intruder began screaming back. But this wasn't a scream of fear. It was a guttural, terrifying roar of aggression. The sound reverberated off the concrete walls. He legitimately sounded like a murderer. The homeowner snapped his mouth shut. The intruder immediately fell silent. The lethal game of cat and mouse began. The homeowner dragged himself along the wall, navigating the maze entirely by touch. And then, he heard it. The soft, deliberate scuff of shoes on concrete. The intruder was moving, too. And the sounds were getting closer. He knows my basement better than I do. The thought was a spike of ice in his veins. He heard heavy, ragged breathing directly behind him. Blind panic took the wheel. He flailed his arms until his fingers finally grazed the wooden base of the staircase. He grabbed the railing and lunged upward. Before his foot could hit the second step, a vice-like grip clamped down on his ankle. The homeowner lost his balance, his head cracking violently against the wooden railing as he was dragged backward down onto the concrete floor. The intruder's strength was terrifying, almost inhuman. He was pulling him away from the stairs, deeper into the dark. Thrashing wildly, fighting for his life, the homeowner delivered a desperate, blind kick into the blackness. His heel connected solidly with bone. The grip on his ankle faltered for a fraction of a second. It was all the time he needed. He twisted his body violently, broke free, and scrambled up the stairs on his hands and knees. The intruder erupted into furious screaming below him. The homeowner burst through the door into the kitchen and slammed it shut. But the terror washed over. The door had no lock. He threw his entire body weight against the wood. Seconds later, heavy footsteps thundered up the basement stairs, followed immediately by a massive, violent crash against the other side of the door. The wood groaned, bowing inward for a terrifying second before the homeowner shoved it back into the frame. The intruder began a relentless, rhythmic assault on the door. The homeowner ripped off his socks for better traction, digging his bare heels into the kitchen floor, knowing with absolute certainty that if the door gave way, he was a dead man. Miraculously, the wood held. After what felt like hours, the assault stopped. Footsteps retreated back down into the basement. The homeowner dove for his phone on the counter, sprinting back to press his weight against the door while dialing 911. When the police finally cleared the house, the intruder had vanished. They discovered a small basement window that had been pried open from the outside. But the most disturbing detail wasn't the broken window. The police noted that not a single item in the house had been stolen. Furthermore, the light switch for the basement was hidden in a very obscure, non-intuitive location. The intruder had known exactly where to find it in the dark to cut the power. The police delivered a chilling hypothesis. The intruder wasn't there to burgle the house. He had been secretly living in the deep recesses of that maze-like basement for an undetermined amount of time. The homeowner broke his lease and moved out for months later. To this day, he is haunted by a single, terrifying conviction: the man living beneath his feet was fully prepared to kill him that night. And if that blind kick hadn't landed, he absolutely would have. The Flash in the Dark. Our next story dials the clock back roughly 2 decades. The narrator was 14 years old, entering that precarious age where parents finally trust you to stay home alone. His parents were driving out of state for a wedding. The original plan dictated that his college-aged sister, who lived only an hour away, would come down to supervise. But the moment the parents' car pulled out of the driveway, the sister texted to announce she was ditching him for a college party. The 14-year-old didn't care. He was thrilled. He lived in a classic, two-story house nestled in a painfully quiet, family-oriented suburban neighborhood. He didn't bother ratting his sister out. He was ready for a weekend of uninterrupted freedom. He spent the first 6 hours doing exactly what any 14-year-old boy would do, aggressively playing Halo on the living room television. It wasn't until just past midnight that the illusion of safety began to fracture. Sprawled on the couch, the boy heard a faint, rhythmic sound. Tap. Wake. Tap. Like. Tap, tap. It was coming from the backyard, striking the exterior siding of the house. He dismissed it immediately. It sounded exactly like a stray tree branch being pushed by the wind. He settled back into his game. A few minutes later, the sound returned. Tap. Right. Tap. Right. Tap, tap. But something was wrong. The tapping had migrated. It was no longer coming from the original location. Whatever was making the noise was deliberately moving along the side of his house. He muted the television. The silence in the house was suddenly deafening. The tapping ceased. For 20 agonizing minutes, he sat frozen, desperately trying to convince himself it was a raccoon or a stray cat. Then came a new sound. It was the same deliberate tapping, but the location made the boy's blood run cold. The living room sat directly above an unfinished basement. The tapping was coming from below him. It was striking the small, ground-level windows that looked out into the yard. His heart hammered against his ribs. He had to know. He crept off the couch and walked silently toward the basement door. He gripped the knob, turned it slowly, and stared down the wooden stairs into the pitch-black void. The tapping was louder now. Consistent. Intentional. Driven by a naive, childlike impulse, he called out into the darkness. Hello. The tapping stopped instantly. A wave of pure dread washed over him. A raccoon doesn't stop knocking when you speak to it. A human does. He desperately wanted to turn on the basement lights, but the switch was located at the very bottom of the stairs. Like. There was absolutely no way he was descending into that darkness. He needed to see what was down there without exposing himself. He pulled the basement door shut, leaving only a tiny crack. He grabbed his old, bulky cell phone, engaged the camera, and turned on the bright LED flash. He stuck his hand through the crack, pointed the lens down toward the basement windows, squeezed his eyes shut, and hit record for just a few seconds. He yanked his arm back, slammed the door shut, and threw the deadbolt lock. Breathing heavily, he pulled up the grainy video on his phone's small screen. It only took 1 second for his reality to completely shatter. Illuminated by the harsh glare of the camera flash, standing directly beneath the basement window, on the inside of the house, was the unmistakable figure of a man. The boy screamed. He abandoned all attempts at bravery, sprinting up the stairs to his bedroom, locking the door, and frantically calling his father, who immediately dispatched the police. While he was still on the phone, the nightmare escalated. The intruder realized he had been spotted. The boy heard heavy, violent footsteps bounding up the basement stairs. Light. A massive bang shook the house. The intruder was hurling his body against the locked basement door, desperately trying to break into the main living area. Bike. Right. Bang. After the sixth violent impact, the house felt deathly silent. Sirens wailed in the distance. When the police finally breached the home, they discovered the basement window had been smashed outward. The intruder had fled into the night. The officers conducted a thorough sweep of the unfinished basement. Several items were missing, but one discovery chilled the officers to the bone. In the corner of the basements, at a small, dusty kitchenette, the police inspected the knife block on the counter. The largest, heaviest butcher knife was gone. The man hadn't just broken into the basement to steal. He had armed himself. And if that 14-year-old boy had walked down those stairs to flip the light switch, he would have walked directly into the blade. To this day, the man in the flash video was never identified. The rustle in the dark. Our third narrative takes us into the heart of a massive, heavily customized suburban home. The narrator was a 16-year-old boy whose parents had transformed their sprawling basement into an ultimate hangout space. It featured a plush sectional couch, a massive television, and several deep storage rooms tucked away in the back. Because his parents rarely ventured downstairs, the basement was effectively his personal kingdom. There were two crucial quirks to this house. First, the family owned an aggressively friendly cat named Rocky, who was routinely locked in the basement overnight so he wouldn't disturb the sleeping parents upstairs. Second, the basement featured a heavy interior that connected directly to the attached garage. For the parents, it was a convenient way to carry in groceries. For a 16-year-old boy, it was the perfect clandestine entrance for sneaking friends into the house. It was a Friday night. The boy had invited a girl named Madeline over for a late-night movie. They were lounging on the sectional couch in the basement, bathed in the glow of the television. It was well past the hour his parents usually banished Rocky downstairs. The boy simply assumed the cat was already down there, likely curled up asleep in one of the dark storage rooms. That is why he didn't panic when he heard the first noise. It was a faint, distinct rustling sound echoing from the black depths of the storage room. It sounded exactly like an animal digging through cardboard boxes. Madeline jumped slightly, but the boy confidently reassured her that it was just his hyperactive cat. They returned their attention to the movie. But the noises didn't stop. Every few minutes, the silence was broken by a soft thud, the scrape of a box being shifted, or a heavy rustle. Each time, Madeline threw him a terrified glance. Each time, he doubled down on the lie, assuring her that Rocky simply loved to climb on things in the dark. He genuinely believed his own excuse. He was completely calm. Right up until the moment he heard a very specific, agonizingly clear sound coming from directly above them. S.C. Rich. Light. Scratch. Light. S.C. Rich. It was coming from the door at the very top of the basement stairs, the door leading to the main floor of the house. The boy's blood turned to ice. He knew that sound intimately. It was Rocky. The cat was upstairs, scratching at the door, begging to be let down into the basement. The math was horrificously simple. If the cat was upstairs, what the hell had been moving around in the dark storage room for the past 30 minutes? He sat frozen on the couch, terrified to speak, terrified to alarm Madeline. But he didn't have to. Light. Madeline suddenly let out a blood-curdling, ear-piercing scream. The boy whipped his head around. Madeline was trembling violently, her finger pointed directly over his shoulder toward the pitch-black maw of the storage room. The boy slowly turned his head. Rolling to a stop on the carpet, directly in front of the storage room door, was a foam football. It hadn't fallen. The trajectory was clear. It had been deliberately tossed out of the darkness. Someone was standing in the shadows of the storage room, watching them, and they had been there the entire time. The boy didn't think. He grabbed Madeline by the arm, violently hauled her off the couch, and dragged her up the basement stairs. They burst through the door, nearly trampling the confused cat, and slammed the heavy wood shut, locking the deadbolt behind them. The house erupted into chaos. Madeline was weeping hysterically. The boy's parents, violently awakened by the screams, immediately dialed 911. While they waited for the sirens, the boy stationed himself on the back deck, keeping a hawkish, unbroken gaze on the garage door, the only viable exit the intruder could use. He watched it relentlessly. It never opened. The police arrived in minutes. They drew their weapons and conducted a massive, tactical sweep of the entire basement and the attached garage. They found nothing. The storage rooms were empty. There was absolutely no sign of forced entry on any of the basement windows, and every single pane of glass was locked securely from the inside. The baffled officers suggested that the intruder must have slipped out through the garage before they arrived. But the boy knew that was impossible. He had watched the garage exit like a hawk the entire time. No one had left. His parents, desperate for a rational explanation, accepted the police's theory. But the boy knows the terrifying truth. The intruder didn't escape through a window. He didn't escape through the garage. The family never found a resolution, and the boy is left with a horrifying, unanswerable question. If the intruder didn't leave the house, where did he go? The Ghost of Aunt Debbie. Our final story dives into the deep, murky waters of family secrets. Every child harbors an innate, primal fear of the basement. For this narrator, that fear was amplified tenfold. His childhood home featured a sprawling, subterranean level that housed the family's only video game console. Like a moth to a flame, the lure of the games frequently forced him down into the dark, despite his paralyzing fear. He was 9 years old, staying up late on a weekend to grind through a stubbornly difficult level on his PlayStation 1. The silence of the basement was oppressive, broken only by the digital hum of the television. To make matters worse, his basement featured a massive, windowless boiler laundry room. It was a cavernous space that remained pitch black at all hours of the day, groaning and hissing with the mechanical sounds of the house's plumbing. He hated that room. On this particular night, the mechanical groans of the boiler room were replaced by a sound that made his 9-year-old heart stop. Cree. Cree. The heavy wooden door of the laundry room slowly swung open on its own. The boy paused his game. A suffocating, heavy silence blanketed the basement. Then, echoing from the absolute blackness of the laundry room, came a sound that defied logic. It was the sound of a woman, moaning and groaning in a low, almost ghost-like register. But the sheer terror of the sound was immediately undercut by a buzz, a realization. The boy recognized the voice. It sounded exactly like his mother. Relief washed over him. He chuckled nervously, calling out, "Nice try, Mom." He assumed she was pulling a cruel prank to scare him upstairs to bed. Looking back, he realizes the absurdity of the assumption. His mother was a stoic, serious woman who despised practical jokes. But the mind of a child clings to whatever logic makes them feel safe. Emboldened by his false deduction, the boy stood up and walked toward the yawning, pitch-black doorway of the laundry room. The groaning head stopped. He peered into the darkness. As his eyes struggled to adjust, a horrifying silhouette slowly materialized in the gloom. It was the distinct outline of a person, standing completely motionless in the center of the dark room. Mom?" he asked, his voice trembling, the false confidence evaporating. He took one step closer. The figure shifted, and in that split second, the boy realized with absolute, terrifying certainty that the person standing in the dark was not his mother. He unleashed a blood-curdling scream, turned on his heel, and sprinted blindly up the wooden stairs. He burst into the living room, hyperventilating, His nightmare was instantly confirmed. Both his mother and his father were sitting on the living room couch, leaping to their feet in response to his screams. "There's a woman in the laundry room," he shrieked, pointing a shaking finger back toward the basement door. His parents exchanged a look of pure, unadulterated panic. Like, they didn't ask questions. They didn't soothe him. They sprinted down the stairs, violently slamming the basement door shut behind them. The boy sat in the living room for what felt like hours, listening to muffled, frantic shouting echoing through the floorboards. When his mother finally emerged, her face was ashen. She ordered him to go directly to bed and asked no questions. The next morning, his parents delivered a clumsy, poorly constructed lie. They claimed they had hired a friend from out of state to hide in the basement and prank him. They laughed it off, treating the entire terrifying ordeal as a massive joke. The boy, desperate for the nightmare to be over, accepted the lie. But as he grew older, a name began slipping from his parents' lips during hushed arguments. Debbie. Whenever he asked who Debbie was, the subject was aggressively changed. At 14, the boy's curiosity morphed into an obsession. He stole his father's credit card and purchased access to a deep-dive genealogical website. He mapped his family tree. He discovered a shocking secret. His mother had a sister. Her name was Debbie. He frantically Googled the name alongside his mother's maiden name. The search engine spat back an obituary. Debbie was dead. Armed with the printout, he confronted his parents, demanding the truth. The color drained from his father's face. He looked at his wife and whispered, "Still tell him." His mother finally cracked. She revealed that her sister Debbie suffered from severe, dangerous mental instability. She vaguely, terrifyingly confessed that Debbie had harmed a lot of people. The family had taken extreme measures to keep her hidden and away from the boy. On that night, years ago, Debbie had broken into the house. She had bypassed the locks, crept into the basement, and hidden herself in the pitch-black laundry room, waiting in the dark while her 9-year-old nephew played video games just feet away. His parents refused to elaborate further. They took the horrific details of Debbie's crimes to the grave. The narrator is now an adult, left with a legacy of chilling, unanswerable questions. Why was she hiding in the basement? What was she planning to do to him? And, most disturbingly, how long had she been living down there in the dark before she finally pushed that door open? Some questions, he admits, are better left buried. Thank you for listening tonight. Remember, the true monsters don't always lurk in the woods or hide in abandoned buildings. Sometimes, they find a way inside. They find a dark corner, and they wait. Stay safe, and sleep with the lights on. I will see you all again very soon.